Hello, hello, boys and girls. Welcome to another episode of the Muscle for Life podcast. This is your host, Michael P. Matthews, and all right, I'll stop being weird. I have a great episode here for you, which is an interview with Eric Helms, who's one of the premier natural bodybuilding coaches in the game. He's a member of the 3D coaching team and is himself a professional natural bodybuilder and strength athlete, which I actually believe, meaning that, a lot of people say they're natural and they're either clearly not or it's very gray, very questionable. In his case, I fully believe that he is natural, which counts for something. If that were not the case, then I probably wouldn't be doing the interview. And I actually reference Eric's scientific work quite frequently in my writing, so it was really a pleasure to get a chance to interview him. Now, as you've probably gathered from the title, this interview is on how to prep for a natural bodybuilding show. And Eric really covers everything, ranging from caloric intake and macro breakdowns to weightlifting and cardio strategies and supplementation and much more. It's a very, very informative interview. I think you're really going to like it. And especially so if you are getting ready to prep for a show or are considering doing a show, then yeah, you definitely need to listen to this interview because it can save you from all kinds of trials and tribulations that I have seen firsthand in my work many, many times from people that reach out to me that are suffering through contest prep under the poor guidance of some coach they found on the interwebs. And on the other hand, if you're like me and you have no intention of competing, but you're just working on building your best body ever, then you too are going to get a lot out of this interview because the principles that Eric talks about apply to everyone looking to lose fat and not muscle, not just competitive bodybuilders. So I hope I have sufficiently whetted your appetite, and let's get to the interview. Eric, I'm excited to have you on the podcast. You're one of the people that has been asked for the most by listeners and readers and stuff. So,
wow. Well, that's an honor to hear, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so obviously I already kind of introduced in the beginning of the podcast who you are and why people should listen to you, but can you give a little bit more background specifically in the context of contest prep, which is what we're going to be talking about, and what are your experiences personally and also as a coach, and just so people can understand where you're coming from in that regard?
For sure. So I've been competing in natural bodybuilding myself since 2007. I've done about 9 shows, and then since 2009, I've been a professional coach for natural bodybuilding. So I've coached people in, both women and men in multiple divisions, but mostly competitive bodybuilding. And I think I've figured it out one time. I've worked with something like 300-ish people. Not all of them are contest preppers, but a large proportion would be. And I've also dedicated my academic career to studying this type of thing. So I did my master's specifically looking at protein and macronutrient manipulation in dieting strength athletes, and wrote a review paper with Peter Fitchen and Alan Aragon on the training side of things, looking at evidence-based best practice for natural bodybuilders. And then
I've referenced that quite a bit.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. Yeah,
spreading the good word.
Thank you very much. And then on the training side of it, Schoenfeld hopped on there and helped us out there too. So I guess to say I've coached it, I've experienced it, and I've theorized about it. So not to say I'm the end all be all, but this is my specialty.
Absolutely. So with that in mind, what would you say, let's just start with what are the 3, 4, 5 kind of biggest prep mistakes or myths that are kind of out there that you have to consistently disabuse people of and correct?
I'd say the most common one is just not dieting long enough. Mm-hmm. And it's almost cliche to say that now, or at least it feels like it because I'm preaching it all the time. Mm-hmm. But it has multiple reasons why. I mean, one is that before I'd even say the early 2000s, the conditioning standard was lower. The rarity of striated glutes was pretty rare. Like you'd see the one show or the one guy in the show with the striated glutes, and he typically is getting very close to winning in natural bodybuilding, where size isn't as much of a dominating factor. And then even if you looked at like the IFBB pro ranks, if you follow the other side of the sport, It wasn't until probably the 90s where you started to see guys show up with striated glutes regularly, and it was pretty rare before that. So one is the conditioning standards. So what that means is that people were dieting under the constraints of a different system before, so they didn't need to get quite as lean. And the leaner you get, the harder it gets. So it kind of adds a disproportionate amount of time that one should be dieting. And then in natural bodybuilding, holding onto your muscle in that phase is also the hardest. So it kind of extends it further. So you've got the tradition going against the grain here of the idea that, hey, maybe we should be dieting longer. And then you've also just got the unexperienced eye of a novice competitor. These first time mistakes, they're based on your experience level. And when you've never competed, you don't quite know just how much body fat is really there that has to go, because it all has to go,
especially when with the lights and how harsh it is, and what might look good under the right lighting that you like, and then doesn't look so good or doesn't look right under competition.
100%. Yeah, you spending 10 minutes to set up an Instagram photo in half natty lighting is not the same as being on stage for 20 minutes.
Exactly. That natural lighting, the perfect. I think I see a little bit of ab vascularity.
Right. Exactly. So most of the time, people need to lose sometimes as much as twice the amount they think they have to lose.
Wow.
I'll tell you a funny story, because I'm not immune to this either. In like 2005, I think I did my first quote unquote cut, and I was 220 pounds at the time. I'm 6 foot, so it wasn't like huge or anything. And I thought if I dieted down to 200 pounds, I'd be pretty close to stage ready. So fast forward about twice as long later than I thought it would take. I'm 198, and I'm probably 14% body fat. So I just didn't realize how fat I was, to get there. So I basically died to the point where I'd want to start a prep. And
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then I was right. I ended up competing at about 178 in 2007. So
wow.
So there you go.
Cool. So that's is that kind of like all one? You'd say that's one kind of big mistake, is not dieting enough.
That's a big one. There are others. Probably some of the most common ones are that the rules for muscle for training essentially change. That you have to do things to burn extra calories or get cut up. You want to train higher rep, lighter load, and the reality is that the same principles that guide training apply at all times. You probably can build a little bit of muscle in the beginning of prep, even though you're starting to diet, unless you're doing something crazy.
Yep.
And even at the stages in prep where that's not happening and you're probably losing small amounts of muscle, it's not that you're just trying to retain muscle. It's you're trying to create the same stimulus that you would to gain muscle. It's just you don't have the nutritional support necessarily. So sure, you have to pay attention to recovery, potentially lower volume, do deloads more frequently, maybe use an RPE scale to kind of auto-regulate all that, because you're going to be less consistent in terms of your energy levels. But
can you explain real quick what that is?
Yeah, definitely. So basically, auto-regulation is just the idea that you need to systematically go by feel. And it's very important what that word systematically is, because auto-regulation isn't just, yeah, man, I'm going to just go by feel today. It really is like...
I feel like biceps and chest again for the fourth time this week.
Right, not auto-regulation, right? Hashtag not autoreg. But so autoregulation has a systematic format, and that's what I'm doing for my PhD. And probably the main thing I'm studying is what's called an RPE scale, a rating of perceived exertion. And I'm specifically looking at a scale that's based on how many repetitions remain at the end of a set. So if you did 8 reps with your 10 rep max, that would be an 8 RPE. You had 2 repetitions in reserve. A 9 would be 1, 10 would be 0 max. Couldn't have done more weight, more load.
Sure.
And this becomes a very useful tool when your strength is less consistent. So like during contest prep. And there are other methods there, flexible nonlinear periodization, which just basically says, hey, you've got light, medium, and hard days, and you should rate yourself on a 1 to 10 scale, decide how you feel that day, and then choose which one you want to do. And we know that it produces at least as good of progress as having a fixed exercise or training day order.
Right.
In the end, if you get all the volume done within the week and you're, getting in quality work when you're doing it, you're probably going to get the same results. So those kind of principles are very useful during contest prep. But anyway, I think the main take-home point is that the same principles that guide gaining muscle should be used during contest prep, even if you might only be retaining it. You just have to be more mindful of your recovery.
Yep. Makes sense. And anything related to cardio?
Sure.
Like,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sure you see that. I'm sure you see that. I mean, I know I get a lot of emails about my coach
Yeah.
wants me to do 2 hours of cardio a day, 7 days a week, and eat 1,000 calories a day.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's almost not just cardio. It's more of, I think actually it goes back to the first one. Most of the time when I run into someone who's on 1,000 calories and doing two a day cardio, it's because they didn't give themselves enough time.
Mm.
There may come a time in a diet. In fact, there probably will be, where you have to do more cardio than you want, and
Yep.
eat less calories than you want, and not just from a position of I like pizza. That's what I want. I mean, when I say want, I mean you look at it objectively as someone who's a competitive athlete and think, what's the best, calorie intake or the lowest I'd want to go to
Yeah.
not lose muscle. And you might go, well, shit, I have to go lower than that.
Yeah.
And
I mean, you also reach that point where I haven't competed, but I've dieted down to pretty lean, like where there's not much left to grab anywhere, ab veins and whatever for photo shoots. And you get to that point where it's a visceral type of feeling. It's not just I want pizza. It's like my body is starved for energy. That's the only thing I can feel.
Yeah. So yeah, you may have to get to a point where you've got to do more cardio than you want, lower calories than you want, and you do what you have to do because you're a competitive athlete. But yeah, I mean, most of the time when you run into people who are doing insane amounts of cardio or inordinately low calories, it's because they didn't set up the diet in the first place. They either started too heavy, or they didn't have enough time to diet related to how heavy they started. Or they dug themselves into a hole very early on. So you can actually take a faster pace, early on in a prep, because obviously the more body fat you lose, the easier it is to lose it.
Yep.
But it shouldn't be like Biggest Loser fast. We're talking like losing 1% of your body weight per week instead of 0.5%.
Right. Right. And before we just move on to how to do it right, is there anything relating to, because I mean, I get asked about this a lot. And again, as someone who hasn't competed and I never have really done much in the way of manipulating sodium, potassium, or water for photo shoots, I just more took the approach you're talking about, where I just gave myself enough time to get really lean. And I figure I see once I've lost enough body fat and I just carb up and do some push-ups, all of a sudden I look pretty good. You know what I mean? And so is that more kind of myth that you need to be playing a lot with your water and your salt and your potassium, or is that something that will actually go in when you kind of talk about peak week? And
yeah, there's bits and pieces that might make sense, and there's other bits that are completely myth and even counterproductive.
Right.
And you're right. I think the biggest myth is just the amount of effect it has. Peaking is a lot more, in my opinion, correcting the flatness that you see while dieting than it is doing something that will make a big impact. That's a lot of times people don't understand why when I talk on podcasts about peaking, why I say, well, if you're not shredded, it's not going to do much.
Right.
Like, well, why not? I mean, like, I don't get that. The reason why is if you're not shredded, you're not typically depleted. You don't have highly depleted glycogen stores because you have body fat to pull from still.
Right.
You're not on super low calories, probably. You're not doing tons of cardio, probably. Maybe you're playing catch up, but even then, you just don't typically have that flatness when you have minimal levels of body fat. So glycogen's constantly getting pulled from. At least that's my theory as to why it seems to work better.
That makes sense. So it's more about filling up as opposed to trying to manipulate, because really it comes down to it when the people that write me, they're trying to manipulate subcutaneous water levels, and they think that that's going to make a big difference when, if you're, like you were saying, if you're not lean enough, it doesn't really you're going to look, I don't know, 5% better for like a day maybe or something.
At best. Yeah. And yeah, so I mean, there are some other things that happen during contest prep. Is your blood pressure drops a lot lower. This is just true in anyone that's been calorie reduced for a long period and gets to low body fat levels. So it's harder to get a pump. It might make sense to try to do things to raise your blood pressure, which when we talk about the hows, we can get into that.
Cool.
But yeah, certainly someone just kept it relatively simple, carved up and did a pump up, they're getting the vast majority of the benefits from a peak week.
Cool. So my uninformed, simplistic approach was more informed and better than I thought.
To be honest, if you keep it simple and logical, you're going to be right most of the time, you know?
As most things go in life. Okay, so let's now get to how to do it right. So let's start at the top here. So you're going to be starting a prep, and I'm just going to kind of pass the mic to you again. And how does this roll out?
Yeah, so ideally, what is happening is you're looking at a show. If you're, say, a competitive bodybuilder, so male or female, knowing that you're going to have to get to the lowest levels of body fat that you can, you're probably looking at a minimum of 5 to 7 months out, especially if you're a first time, because more time is if anything better, because it gives you more flexibility. You don't have to diet as fast.
And what would you say is a good starting point in terms of body fat percentage for guys and girls?
Yeah, good question. I would say probably 15% at max for men, and then about 7 or 8% higher for women. That's basically kind of the rough scaling equivalent.
Just so everybody understands why those numbers, why not? Is it just a factor of time, like what you ran into?
Pretty much.
Okay.
It is just a factor of time. Some people will walk around 11%. Some people will walk around at 17%. But we're talking men again.
Sure.
But based on their natural settling point. But it is just a factor of time. It takes time to lose that much body fat, and having more time is almost always better. Worst case scenario, you're one of those people who loses fat very easily, and you're ready in 4 months. Okay, so you've got another 2 months to diet. Well, that's eating up into the show. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Or you can find an early warm-up show to do. It's like it's fine. There's shows all the time.
Yeah.
Depending on where you live. So yeah, that's step one. And I would say even before that, because it's very difficult to accurately gauge those two things. How much time do I need, and what level of body fat should I be as a first timer, is probably contact someone who is experienced. Doesn't necessarily need to be a coach, but have someone who knows what they're doing, get an objective look at you like a year out, and go, okay, let's think about what position do we want to be once we're at that 6 month-ish mark. Like when we coach people, that's what we like to do is we encourage people to do a Skype consultation with us, which then comes off their price for coaching. So it's like we try to make it like as definitely do this as possible because it makes our jobs easier.
Right.
Talk to us like a year out so we can game plan. Here's where I want you to try to work your calories up to or towards. Here's the heaviest I want you to be before contest prep start. Let's get you on a sensible weight training plan. Let's get you on an appropriate amount of cardio for the off season, which might be none, depending on what they're doing, or it might be a little. And then we know that we're in a position to be successful at the start of that prep, because a lot of the times we're inheriting very bad situations. Someone's 6 months out and their calories in the off season are what we would diet them on, and they're probably having like these cyclical binges. That's a terrible place to start a contest prep. Your willpower is already depleted, your calories are low, your total daily energy expenditure is probably about as low as it can be at that body weight. It's not a good place to be. Or we have to sell you on a very different type of training that we have to titrate in. So to get your emotional buy-in, and that's not the best way, to retain muscle or progress during prep. And we're giving up a little something there. So there's a lot of pre-prep work that basically needs to be done so that the bodybuilder is on the same page. And, in our case, sometimes now that we have a reasonable presence within our community, people don't come to us as
say, hey, I have 4 months left. What do I do?
Yeah. So it's becoming, at least we're having a dent on the people who apply to us for contest prep. I don't know how much we're affecting the entire community. I'd like to think it's a positive effect.
Right.
But yeah, that's step one. Step two is then, all right, so you're 5 to 7 months out, you're appropriately lean, and you have a sound training plan. We'll talk training first because it's relatively easy. I would say cardio should probably only be about 20% of it's just to throw some random numbers out there of the deficit you get. And I would take a long time before you got past this, but a rough limit would be not doing more cardio than you're doing in terms of weight training. If you were to compare like hours,
sure.
So if you're doing 8 hours of weight training a week, try not to go over 8 hours of cardio unless you absolutely have to. And that's kind of almost always the always rule, unless you have to.
And do you normally start people with that? Like, would you start that at a 1-to-1 ratio?
No, way less than that.
Okay.
So
I say, wow, that's a lot of, that's
aggressive. like a max, 4 or 5 months into the diet,
And just so people understand, when you're talking about cardio, would you include something like walking, like very low intensity, or, you know what I mean?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, I typically stray on the fringe ends of the cardio spectrum. So either we're doing a very small amount of low impact, which is important, high intensity type of interval stuff. And that's only maybe once or twice a week.
Yep.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's just what I call calorie burning.
Yep.
Low intensity, steady state, not going on a jog, but actually easier than that. Stuff that might get you breathing hard a little bit, but you can still talk while you're doing it.
Yep.
And that's just basically because we don't want a cardiovascular adaptation. We're not looking to get you better at endurance. We're looking to lose fat and burn extra calories and combat decreases in NEAT or your normal calorie burning outside of the gym. So
there's probably something to be said for recovery too. If you're trying to do too much stuff in the middle, like jogging would be a good example, it's going to cut into your recovery. It's going to make your weight training harder, and it's just going to make the whole process harder probably.
Definitely. Going on a walk, if anything, might help you, recover a little bit. But going on a run, probably not, Maybe if you're very well adapted.
I kind of come to the same recommendation. It's either do as like me personally, when I'm cutting, I like to do maybe an hour to an hour and a half of HIIT on a bicycle per week, and actually work hard at it. Something that is it qualifies as actual as HIIT. Like I'm not going to be sitting there having a conversation while I'm doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So keep that on and then you do some walking as well. I just don't like being in the middle because I found the exact things you're talking about.
Yep. And I like that you pointed out the bicycle. Cool thing about a bike, it's zero impact.
Yep.
So you're not going to get your joints beat up. And if you can think of what the difference between a concentric and an eccentric contraction are, in most activities in life, we do concentric and eccentric. Like you're running, the eccentric is when your muscle is lengthening while it is producing force, right? So that is when you're braking, if you could think about it. And that actually causes more micro tears in the muscle fiber, which is fine under the context of regular training. But when you add more, especially high speed or high impact eccentric contractions on top of your training, that can interfere with recovery. And a bike, because you're never actually hitting the ground and you're constantly moving forward, it's a circle. You're basically all concentric.
Yeah.
So the recovery component is even less. And there's even some data showing that bicycling interferes, quote unquote, less with weight training. So it's always a good choice. It doesn't burn as many calories though. I personally am a fan of the elliptical if I'm going to do gym cardio. When I'm not just going on a walk with my wife or doing like very light barbell complexes or kettlebell swing kind of thing.
And you like that because elliptical burns more calories.
Elliptical burns more calories. You're standing up. It's full body. It's the same principle. You're pretty much always concentric and low impact, which is probably more important. And then the like the bar cardio and the kettlebell stuff, I just enjoy it more. So it's more sustainable for me.
Yeah.
And I have to diet a while. That's another thing. Is just make sure regardless of everything we said, the cardio needs to be semi-enjoyable because you might end up doing a lot of it.
Yeah.
So it will go from being semi-enjoyable to I semi-hate this, and that's much better than starting with I semi-hate this, because by the end you'll not want to do it at all.
That's very true. I guess that's also one of the reasons why I've kind of just gravitated toward the bike is one, there's the research that you're talking about. I've read that research and I've referenced it, whatever. But then also I kind of just enjoy an upright bike, and like I don't really watch TV, so that's my time where I would take my iPad and watch TV show. So I don't know. This is something I liked.
Yeah. I was, even though I liked the elliptical, I remember during my last prep, I was doing my first master's where I had a lot of coursework, and I was just walking on a treadmill so I could study, So there's life always interacts with these recommendations, and you find what fits the best bill for you. So anyway, your cardio, you more or less want to titrate in as needed, not jump out the gates. I think when I start someone, they do 1, maybe 2 sessions, so we're talking an hour total of cardio they might start with.
Right.
And then, like I said, I try to keep it less than the amount of weight training they're doing. And then as far as weight training, it should look pretty damn similar to what you're doing in the off season. A few things that I like to do to kind of hit on that principle of allowing for more recovery is I start instituting mandatory deloads. So like every 4th week is a pretty common one I do. And all the arguments against mandatory deloads, like what if you're not ready, or the whole reason I'm studying auto-regulation.
Right.
Yeah, but it's also very difficult to gauge on your own, and during contest prep, if anything, you want to err on the side of being more conservative with that type of thing. So I think it's a good way to kind of self-check your inner masochist or inner I can't deload during prep, I'm going to lose muscle. Like actually, the opposite will happen, because you're going to sacrifice future training quality.
It just helps you prevent bigger mistakes, basically, and the downside of doing it is pretty minimal.
Yeah, it's a check and balance. This is a good way to think of it. So yeah, that is very useful. And then, trying to maintain your volume and make steady but very small progression in your weight for, say, the first third of a prep, so maybe the first 8 weeks, when your body fat isn't too low, probably happen pretty successfully. And then it's not a bad idea once you get to kind of like the halfway mark to think about a slight reduction in volume, especially if you're feeling it. This is the kind of thing that I, as a coach, when I'm working with someone, I control tightly. So I can say, that you don't necessarily need to just drop volume straight away. But when someone is self-coached, that's probably where you want to think about. It's very difficult to make that decision on your own unless you're highly experienced. So it might be better to kind of institute a mandatory 10% reduction in volume at the halfway mark in prep, and then another 10% when you're in the final third, just in the form of reducing sets here and there from your harder movements, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or even 10, 20, 25%, so that at the very end of prep, you're doing like 60% of what you might normally do. I don't think there's anything.
And do you take mainly from the bigger compounds for that, the deadlift, squat, pressing?
Yeah, definitely. And typically, when I'm doing it, people start complaining about not complaining. They start letting me know as their coach when they're feeling, man, those 4 sets of squats really beat me up. And I go, all right, let's do 2. And they're like, what? Oh my God, I can't do that. I talk them into it,
Yeah.
I'm like, and it is very true that the amount of volume it takes to maintain muscle is substantially less than it takes to try to gain it. So, is that true in a deficit? We don't have great data on that, but from what I've seen, the benefits are greater than the cost. You trying to keep in the same kind of training volume that was at the peak of your off season when you're 60% body fat and doing cardio, is not going to go well. So yeah, it's a good idea to think, and that's actually one upside to that kind of old school approach of let's just lower the weights and up the reps. They're probably maintaining volume, but the stress per unit of volume is a lot less. The only downside is they're removing one of the core stimuli from of weight training, which is progressive overload. Yeah. They're just kind of going for the pump and repping out the high stuff. So,
and just to that point, so people get that it's key to keep your heavy lifting in.
Yes.
And not, because of course that is like we were talking about in the beginning of the podcast. That's one of the more common things that I also hear just from people asking. It's one of those bits of gym lore that if you want to get really shredded and have striated glutes and have striated anything, you need to do a bunch of high rep stuff and get a huge pump. And
yeah, I mean that there is value in training with a variety of rep ranges.
Sure.
And bodybuilders should be doing multiple angles and isolation work, but it should all be built on the back of a core basis of compound movements trained in a moderately heavy rep range, at least. So that is that, and also it encourages progressive overload. Like there was a period where I saw more impressive physiques, of course, with fat on them at local powerlifting meets than I did at local bodybuilding shows. And this was a long time ago. We're talking 2000, like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think it was just because progressive overload was just something that was not commonly understood. You know? Even if the powerlifters weren't training in the most appropriate way for maximal hypertrophy, they were always trying to add weight to the bar, and it was something they did obsessively on all movements. So, you saw better physiques there,
Yeah.
I saw a lot more kind of physiques missing body parts in bodybuilding shows, So yeah, I think it's very important that bodybuilders understand that principle reigns supreme all the time, and you can't always do it when you're,
You can try though.
Yeah, exactly. With also keeping in mind that, playing the recovery card is very important, like those mandatory deloads, reducing volume at a certain point.
And is there anything else recovery-wise that you find helps?
Emphasizing sleep. Sleep is so important, and there does become a point where, and it doesn't happen to everybody, but it almost seems like kind of like a dieting adaptation where sleep is messed up. This can sometimes be affected by micronutrient intake, or macronutrient intake, so you can play with a nonlinear diet where you have refeeds to try to, which we'll talk about more, to maybe at least get a few days of good rest, or maybe a multivitamin or switching up your food sources to try to avoid deficiencies.
Do you find that even strategies or ways to relax and just kind of lower cortisol levels can help? Because I've worked with people that are beyond, they're not prepping for shows, but, dieting, wanting to get lean, they're a couple months in, and you add the stress of that on the stress of everyday life, and they don't have anything really worked out in terms of personal routine to like chill out.
Structure is huge for everything. and structure for stress management is huge as well. So I've made the recommendations to people to start a gratitude journal.
Mm-hmm.
I've made the
Like the
recommendation
5-minute journal. Have you seen that?
yeah, stuff like that, like where you keep it next to your bed at night. You open it up and you write 3 positive things about your life. Not bullshit things that you actually have to think about it if you're kind of a negative person, but that's that's a good thing for you then, especially. And there's actually research on gratitude in general,
Mm-hmm.
and how that can have a positive effect on your mind state. Other things that I've recommended are, hey, no screen time after like 9 p.m.
Right.
And like for example, your iPhone has like an auto thing you can put on it. If you're like, I have an iPhone 6, I don't know when they start coming out, where it'll like shade shift, so it's not emitting as much
changes
light.
Yeah, the temperature of the light. Yeah,
exactly. And so because we're nothing if not animals, who have just kind of created a technological society, and we still body responds to the sun and has a circadian rhythm. So if it's 11 p.m. and all these lights are on, that confuses things a little bit. It's not like you can't go to sleep or the sleep quality shit, but if you're already having trouble with sleep, it's not a bad idea to try to maximize all those possibilities.
Yeah,
I have recommended meditation in a few cases. It's not a regular thing I do because people often kind of they're like woo alarm goes off. But for the right person who I think would be benefited from it, finding some quiet time of not thinking is not a bad thing. I've had some other more individualized strange recommendations, like I don't want you to watch YouTube for a week, or I don't want you to read any articles for a week. Kind of the overanalyze.
Avoid the news.
Yeah. And some of it's like the overanalyzing, like constantly finding, like there's got to be, I can always do more. And it's like, actually what we need to work on is your mindset of thinking you can always do more, because everything's perfect right now. You just need to chill the hell out. Or just staying away from things that are pretty negative, like American media. So it just totally depends on the situation and the person, but definitely doing things to manage stress levels and make sure that your sleep is there is very important. For the people who just cannot sleep through the night, like they wake up after 4 hours and they're up when they start dieting, there's absolutely nothing wrong with naps. You might be thinking, well, it's not as good as 8 hours solid. You're right, but look, you're not going to get 8 hours solid. So find a time in the day where you can schedule a couple half-an-hour naps, and that will actually make a substantial difference. I had this problem during one of my preps, and I remember just how terrible I'd feel. And then when I had the half-an-hour nap, it would just be like a bolt of energy hit me when I woke
rejuvenation.
up. Yeah. And I don't want to feel like that in the off season. I just feel, oh, that was nice, but it's so much different when you're depleted. So that's basically the full extent of what I do in terms of other things helping with recovery that are a little more intangible.
Cool. Okay, cool. So I kind of diverted you there, but
all good, man.
I think it was
a good diversion.
Okay, good. So then we can just get back to, so you're in the process now. We've gone over that you're not. The last thing was training, and so so they're kind of rolling along. Their cardio is low. At this point probably they haven't changed much in the way of training volume yet. And is there anything on the nutritional side that is worth highlighting? And
that's the everything.
Well, sure.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to get training out of the way first. So let's roll it back to the very, very start. So we've got an idea of what we're going to do with our cardio and our training throughout prep. When you're going to start, how heavy you should be. Another thing that you want to start at least, say, probably a month before your diet starts is actually tracking calories. Because if you, during contest prep, to make sure you keep losing fat, you're going to want to be manipulating your calorie and macronutrient intake. And it's a lot easier to do that and less of a kind of shock to your mental system if you have some time doing that. If you go from just eating and not tracking at all, which is nothing wrong with, in my opinion, so long as you're hitting a certain amount of protein, your calories are there, you're getting some fruits and vegetables in, and you're having protein around your workouts, and you're ticking a few boxes of making things as optimal as they can be in the off season. Like for example, right now, I ensure I hit a minimum amount of protein. I ensure I have at least 4 protein dosings a day. I ensure that I'm gaining or losing weight at the rate I want, and I make sure that I get, my multivitamin, my fish oil, and taking my creatine or whatever, and or whatever. Yeah, definitely just creatine, and then my creatine, whatever. Just the D-ball. No, but so like I have the protons, right? I have the boxes I tick in the off season. but it's a lot less. It's the minimal amount I can get away with tracking and still being optimal, which is a different formula than during contest prep, where you want to make sure almost all your bases are covered because things matter more. So anyway, if I was to prep, and what I recommend to people who are in kind of that state in the off season, where they're maybe just tracking protein, is to start tracking all 3 macronutrients and weighing all their foods, eating out less, and getting very used to keeping like either a MyFitnessPal or a FitDay or My Macros, whatever, tracking going, so that it's not a huge pain in the ass and it's something they've integrated into their life and that is not a stressor when they start prep. And the side effect of this is you end up knowing exactly what your maintenance calories or your gaining calories are.
Yep.
So you have a good idea of where to go. So if you know you're maintaining roughly 3,000 calories, and you know that there's roughly 3,500 calories in a pound of fat, and if you want to create an X amount of deficit, you can play with that knowledge. So for example, I'll use myself. I'm a 200-pound male, and I want to try to lose, let's say 1% of my body weight to start, which is about the fastest you want to go, and then slower to like 0.5. So you're always going to try to fall between 0.5 to 1% of your body weight loss per week. And that's body weight, not body fat. Obviously, you want to see
body fat would be nice.
Right, it'd be great, yeah. And maybe that is happening. It's just you can't. There's no good measure to check.
Sure.
That. So you really, am I maintaining performance? Am I looking better? And am I losing at the right weight with my body weight?
Right.
So anyway, let's say I want to lose 1% of my body weight per week. That's 2 pounds. That's roughly a 7,000 calorie deficit over the course of the week. So that means I need to create a 1,000 calorie deficit on a day-to-day basis, mostly from my diet, right? So let's say I'm doing some cardio. So let's go to 2,200 on low days. Right, that would be an example of someone with a 3,000 calorie,
Yeah, that's me. My with my lifestyle, I mean, in my BMR and in my metabolic, whatever, I'm about 3,000 calories a day. And like you, also, I'll eat intuitively, but I have my rules. I have getting enough protein. I maybe even eat a bit more fruits and vegetables than I do, a bit more than the 2 to 3 servings, just because I like them and it's healthy and it's a good idea. Blah blah blah. Same supplements and stuff. But yeah, that's me. When I start cutting, I usually will start 2,400-ish because I'll do a little bit more cardio. But
yeah, so perfect. Those are 2 examples of what I do and what you do that fall within the guidelines of what probably makes sense for guys our size and with some of the lifestyle where we're on the computer most of the time for a job, right? And that's becoming more and more common. So it may, so play with the amount of cardio, so long as you're not going over that amount you're doing the weight training, and play with the amount of food, and then just double check it. So you're looking at a 7-day average of your weigh-in. So I actually do recommend weighing in daily, first thing in the morning, nude, right when you wake up, after you use the toilet, before you eat or drink anything, so you can get a consistent number. And then those numbers on a day-to-day basis matter 0. You just want an average.
Yep.
And then you're just comparing averages.
And just so people understand why, it's because your daily numbers can fluctuate based on water and going to the bathroom more, going to the bathroom less, whatever. So it's so you don't freak out over why did I gain 1 pound? What did I do wrong? Let me just go binge now.
Yeah, exactly. There's a ton of biological noise. Whether you had a higher sodium day, or whether you had more of your carbs at night, whether it was a refeed, which we'll talk about, which is normal to affect your weigh-ins. All those things are going to change how much sleep you got, what time you weighed in, right? The more time you spend breathing and not drinking water, more moisture losses, and the more time not bringing water in, you'll weigh less. So if you went to bed and slept in late and weighed in, you'd be like, I had a new low. It's like, hey, kind of. So yeah, all those things will get mostly eliminated by a 7-day average. And I like to go at probably 2 weeks before making changes anyway. So if you can get 2 7-day averages and compare them to your last 2 7-day averages, then you can get a really good idea of whether or not you're actually making progress before you just make arbitrary cuts. And then we're talking 100, 200 calorie changes most of the time that you would make on a regular basis if you were plateaued, just so you don't end up digging yourself into a hole too quickly. So that's basically the big picture calorie stuff. In terms of refeed, which I mentioned, I like to have a few days at maintenance calories. I would love there to be more research on this, but what we have at the moment, as we know, a fair number of studies show that an intermittent approach to dieting, so some days where you're dieting, some days where you're not, seems to be superior in not all studies, but some, compared to just a straight everyday deficit. And this makes sense for a lot of reasons. I think psychologically is a big part of it.
Yeah.
Having that kind of reward or just having that day off is pretty important. And there's some studies showing like mental acceptance, like being on, say, 1,500 calories for 6 days in a row in obese people, and then one day where you're in maintenance, was easier to accept than having all days at even lower calories than 1,500. So, and I think that holds true with most people. There's also, when you're training, glycogen gets depleted from training and having low calories. So even when you're higher in body fat, and a lot of the rationale that we would normally talk about as a reason to refeed isn't there, replenishing glycogen and having a day off from dieting, I think can help with training, muscle retention, and sanity. So I normally start people with one refeed a week at the beginning, and then once they hit about a third into the diet, then I go to 2, and then I might end up going to 3, just depending on the individual.
And how do those refeeds look macronutritionally?
Yeah, they are a little more carb dominant, but for the most part, they are just at your maintenance levels, and they pretty much mirror your fat and protein intake from your other days of the week where you're dieting, and then I bring the carbs up to reach maintenance levels, and that's because carbohydrate will primarily replenish glycogen, and it also has an impact on some of the hormones associated with your total daily energy expenditure.
Right.
So it's tends to be one of your kind of regulators for am I starving or not, if you quote unquote will.
So leptin being the main one.
Right. Yeah. Leptin. And I don't want people to get too caught up on leptin because there's a lot of downstream effects. There's other things that matter. So that's why I was saying some of the hormones.
Sure.
I like to talk around it. But definitely. Fat and protein don't have the same effect on leptin that carbohydrate does. But total calories do matter as well. Right. So yeah. And it's important that you chase a slower rate of weight loss as the diet progresses. As you get leaner, it's harder to liberate more, and your energy expenditure is going to go down anyway. So it probably makes sense to have a lower rate of weight loss. So maybe like 0.7% of your body weight would be targeted after the first third of the diet, and then towards the end, 0.5%. And this also works nicely with having more refeeds, because obviously a day in maintenance is a day you can't accumulate a deficit. But when you only have to lose half as much at the end of the diet per week as you were at the beginning, then you can spread it out over fewer days, but it's not as large of a deficit. It's kind of about the same.
Makes sense.
So it doesn't become problematic if you take that approach. If you strictly adhere to a 1% rate of weight loss the whole time, that's a problem in and of itself. And as you take away dieting days, those deficits get larger and larger, and that can become problematic.
Yeah.
So that's the overall structure of how you would have your deficits laid out over the course of, say, that quote unquote 6-month-ish period. But I also like to have what's called diet breaks. So about every 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the individual, I like to take a week at maintenance on all days. This has been a game changer for our clients at 3DMJ, that we've started implementing this in the last couple of years in terms of breaking plateaus, getting leaner, maintaining muscle, and maintaining a higher calorie level, and just not feeling as crappy by the time the shows up.
And question: so on when you're determining what is maintenance at that point, are you assuming that it's the maintenance of when they started, or are you assuming it's a bit lower because of physiological adaptations and they weigh less and blah blah blah?
Second, yeah, exactly the latter. Because if you were to take them back to when they were 10 pounds heavier and they hadn't been dieting, that would probably be a slight surplus.
Right.
So yeah, you kind of have to look at what was the most recent amounts of weight loss. Don't look at a plateaued week, because that can be a water weight thing covering it up. But a lot of the times it's just increasing like 300 to 500 calories from where you're at. Yeah. As a safe bet, because that's probably the size.
Where it might be a slight deficit still, but you're never going to hit exactly. So you just don't want to overshoot it too much.
Right. The goal is to eat as much as you can without gaining fat. Right. And even a slight surplus while you're dieting won't do that, because you're going to be replenishing glycogen for a while. Your energy expenditure is going to rise.
Sure.
And it will stop being a surplus shortly. So typically it's an increase of about 300 to 500 calories. 300 if you're a smaller person, 500 if you're a larger person from where you're at, and then cutting cardio in half. And if you do that for a week, it's going to have more positives than negatives in 9 out of 10 cases. So, and that 10th case is typically when the person psychologically struggles with.
Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about dieting for 5 to 7 months, I would think that would actually be very enjoyable.
Oh yeah. And
I know, like my cuts, I don't know if I've ever cut for more than 12 weeks, just because I haven't competed, so I haven't needed to get down to, strike glute status. And I tend to stay fairly lean just throughout the year. So when I do cut, we're looking at maybe 6 weeks to where I need to be for photo shoots. You know what I mean? So I know after 10 to 12 weeks, I'm feeling done with it. Like I do a refeed once a week, but I'm just kind of like, I'm just going to blitz this and get it done. But 10 to 12 weeks. So I could only imagine there's no way I could do that for another 3 months. I mean, well, I guess I could, but
Yeah, you could.
It probably would feel like I'm going through buds or something like that every day.
But yeah, exactly. You can do it, but there's a cost, and that's why you hear those horror stories of what happens after shows. And having refeeds, having diet breaks, taking a slower approach does seem to reduce the severity of how far that pendulum swings back, and the consequences post-show. People struggling with damn near bulimia in terms of their yo-yo kind of calorie intake. And just how much weight they gain in a very quick period after the show.
Yeah.
So refeeds are a critical piece to this kind of longer term approach to dieting that's required to meet the current conditioning standard in bodybuilding. So that's more or less kind of like, what do we do with calories in terms of the macronutrients themselves? I think anything around or slightly higher than a gram per pound of body weight of protein is pretty reasonable. I normally start right around there at the very start of the diet, and then I don't change it. Just so it stays high and it's satiating at the very least. It may help protect against lean body mass losses as you get deeper into prep and offset some of the catabolic things that happen as you do more cardio and have less glycogen and less body fat. So the body pulls more from protein stores for energy. But yeah, I mean, even just from the mental side of it, that satiating effect is important, and it will support your training. And your training is probably the most important anti-catabolic thing you can do. So protein at that point or higher. Percentage of fat, I normally between 20 to 30% of calories with a minimum intake of about 0.5 grams per kilogram or 0.25 grams per pound, somewhere in there. Is like, don't go lower than that level unless you have to for brief periods of time. It's the always caveat for getting on stage, and then fill in the rest for carbohydrate. And that's kind of the basic setup. And that 20 to 30% range for fat allows a lot of individual variation. If you enjoy more fat, do better on a high fat diet, aren't affected by lower carbs, you can take it up to 30%, and that would be totally fine.
Sure.
Even higher in some cases, 35, 40%, if you happen to be one of those people.
Do you find that with the people you've worked with, that higher carb or higher fat tends to be the choice or preference?
It's different courses for different horses, man. And people are all a little different. Unfortunately, sometimes what people like to eat and enjoy and crave aren't always what seems to be most effective for them.
Yeah.
I've definitely had people who are like, no, I'd rather eat 25 grams of fat. And I'm like, I just don't think that's a good idea for 6 months, maybe for a 4-week push phase.
Yeah.
They're doing everything they can to preserve their carbohydrate intake. And there are people who would do fine with that same setup, but there are others who are negatively affected by it. Their sleep starts getting worse. They're enjoying their meals more, but there are negative effects to it.
Yeah.
So, but on the other side of it, there are people who do better on a low fat, high carb diet, and maybe they want to eat more fat. It's not always that those wires cross. Sometimes they line up where the person doesn't really care. But yeah, not everyone has significant differential effects between carbohydrate and fat, and where the deficit comes from. Personal preference does matter, but some people do, respond differently.
Yeah, I've worked with a lot of people, not for contest prep, but just, everyday people that they want to get fit, and going from, let's say, guys starting in the 20s and wanting to get it down to about 10 or whatever. And I would say the preference probably is generally for more carbs just because of how they feel, but fats are not super low. I mean, if it's around 20%, but that's just in working with people, it seems for a lot of women as well, mainly because I guess they like how they feel in their workouts. They like their higher glycogen levels and higher energy levels, but that's also a different animal altogether when you're talking about a guy spending a couple months to go from 20% to maybe 12 or 11 or something like that versus what you're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. It is like I put out these quote unquote rules, and then someone will see a client of ours who we have on 10% of their calories from fat. They don't realize that is a 4-week period where we're like, look, we have to push, and you do better on higher carbs, so we're going to maintain carbohydrate intake and find a deficit there. And then they go, oh my God, it's
what is that?
That's,
you're going to ruin their endocrine system.
Yeah, you're going to put them on TRT. Right. But like a month is just like it really like you're not going to get a fat deficiency in a month. You're not going to have, so it is one of those calculated decisions.
Especially when I'm sure you're being specific on where they're getting those fats from too. Like you're going to make sure they get their omega-3s and
right. You're ensuring they have a fish oil intake. You're talking to them about their dietary sources. You make an agreement with them. And, we've also got an RD on staff. So it's not like we're just, pulling stuff out of our butt.
Yeah.
It is an extreme sport, even on the natural side of it. And you have to do some things that you didn't wish you had to do. You have to rob Peter to pay Paul in almost every case of doing contest prep. It's never ideal, so it's kind of what's the best worst choice to get the person to shred it. So that's more or less macronutrient setup, and that's more or less the calorie spread over the course of the 6-month period, and that's like 95% of it right there.
Right. And quick question on reducing calories, how do you like to go about that? So you had mentioned that you don't know large reductions, 1 to 200 calorie reductions, but can you just quickly explain how do you determine, okay, it's time to reduce calories versus just increase exercise, for example?
Right. So as a coach, I get a lot of data. I'm looking at pictures or video of the person so I can see the visual changes. I'm looking at multiple 7-day averages going back. And, sometimes the 7-day averages don't tell you quite everything. Like if someone hits a new low 2 weeks in a row, but there's a more variation in their weigh-ins, and you go, maybe you're still progressing and they look better, then sure.
Yeah.
Maybe we just start having more water fluctuation, which can definitely happen if they're getting more stress throughout prep. So there are some of those kind of judgment calls you have to make. But if I was to give advice to someone who's self-coached, I would say give yourself a range of acceptable rate of weight loss, say 0.5 to 1% if you want to be broad with it. And then look at your 7-day average and at least wait 2 weeks. And if it doesn't happen over 2 weeks, then it might be time to make that 100 to 200 calorie cut. And I would say cut from where you feel you'll get the least stressed.
Right.
So if it's easy for you to cut 15 grams of fat and you wouldn't even notice, you're like, I just switched to low-fat cheese, boom, do it, know?
Yeah.
And if you get to a point where you feel a 10-gram carb cut or you feel a 10-gram fat cut, then go the other way or even go with adding cardio. The thing with adding cardio, though, is, and this is something a lot of people don't get, is if, let's say you go to the gym and you burn 300 calories, that's not 300 calories of expenditure on top of whatever it is, because you didn't gain extra time. Like if you did an hour of cardio, the day doesn't now last 25 hours. You replaced whatever you would have burned in that hour with that 300. So if you would have burned 100 calories just, farting around your room, you actually only burned 200 additional calories.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to think about that that time being replaced with cardio time.
That's a good point.
And, so cardio is never quite as effective as calorie reductions. And at a certain point, people can also just reduce their expenditure at other times in the day. So you'll get more fatigue from doing more cardio. You do less expenditure during other times in the day. You fidget less. You sleep more, or you just
you don't want to take the stairs anymore up to the office.
Right. So I've seen strange things happen where you add a bunch of cardio and nothing happens, and then you take it away and you do a 15-gram chop in fat or something like that, and then they're losing again.
Interesting,
because you can't as easily outpace drops in energy than you can energy expenditure.
So are you looking to increase exercise more systematically throughout the course of the entire prep, as opposed to, because again, I mean, where you have far more experience with all of this than I do, but my experience just working, not with my own body, but working with people, again, it's just a totally different set of circumstances, but it's usually, let's be as aggressive as we can on the outset, because let's say we're looking at a 2 or 3 month cut, not prepping for a show. It's just to get into a nice body fat range. Let's get as aggressive as we can be on the exercise, which I'm very much have the same mindset as you, where I would never recommend somebody's doing 2 hours of cardio a day ever. But let's come out the gates or with let's say 4 or 5 hours of weightlifting a week, and let's do an hour or 2 of cardio and see where once you're stuck, let's work that cardio or weightlifting up basically to the point where we're just not going to be going beyond this for exercise, or we're going to run into the problems you already talked about. And then let's start reducing, caloric intake. So what you're talking about sounds different though. Is that because it's a longer process, or is it just, you've just found that works better,
It's a longer process, and in the end, because I'm dealing with physique athletes, and maintaining as much muscle as possible is a huge priority. I'm more minimalistic with my cardio, and the weight training is relatively high volume to start with. You know, if someone's a bodybuilder, they're already a high level, intermediate, or advanced lifter, so they're going to be doing a lot of work. They built a high work capacity, and throwing in additional weight training is something that doesn't make quite as much sense for them. And throwing in additional cardio can interfere with that.
I see. So that's why you would rather reduce caloric intake, because it has a less of a systemic impact, basically.
Right, and it's going to have to happen anyway.
True.
You know, like if you were to truly take a bodybuilder and go, all right, you're going to cardio yourself to striated glutes.
Yeah.
Oh my God, they wouldn't look like a bodybuilder at the end. Let's put it that way. And they'd have a great 5K time and a great marathon time.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
What's that marathoner doing up there?
Yeah, exactly. So
I guess also
if they even made it, I mean, their knees would give up.
In the context of refeeds and diet breaks, like we've talked about that also, that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's all about trying to set up and kind of periodize calorie deficits, primarily through nutrition. So I might start them with 1 to 2 cardio sessions, and over a 24-week prep, I might make 3 adjustments to their cardio. You know, however, I might make nutrition adjustments 2 times a month. You know, kind of on average, I guess. And a lot of it is, I do come out of the gates relatively aggressive, just because they have a higher body fat level. They're mentally ready. They've been chomping at the bit. They're in the off season. They built their calories up nice and high. So, what I'll do is, like, let's try to get that 1% loss of body weight per week. And then as soon as they start to get beat up by the diet, there's our first diet break. You know, they're starting to stall. They're not feeling too hot. Their training loads are suffering. Boom, let's take a week off. And then we come back to it. We target a slower percentage, so it might be diet break and then come back with 2 refeeds and only targeting 0.7% of their body weight. So as soon as their body starts to push back, I don't, push harder. I actually ease off the gas pedal, and I found that's a more successful strategy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anything with supplementation?
Yeah, the biggest thing during contest prep is, you're obviously all the same rules apply. You'd still want to take like creatine.
Sure.
You'd still want to ensure your protein intake is up there, and if that means getting some powder in, awesome. But because you're eating less total calories and your macronutrients are being reduced, often your micronutrients are negatively affected. So I'm a little more emphasizing the education around vitamin and mineral supplementation and what micronutrients are typically deficient in people who are bodybuilding, so that the client knows that and they can make the decision to take a multivitamin. And there's some good ones out there that are targeted. So things like essential fatty acids and multivitamin and like vitamin D, those are pretty kind of like staples for someone dieting, in my opinion.
Yeah, and really probably people under. I mean, I think those are smart. That's why I take personally, amongst a few other things, but it's smart regardless of dieting. Because even if you are, again, like I feel like I'm a pretty conscientious eater in getting micronutrient rich foods, but I figure it can't hurt to have a good multivitamin to plug any little holes that there might be, as much as I try to eat leafy greens and a variety of other vegetables and colorful fruits and blah, blah, blah. So, and anything on the fat loss side of things, like, I mean, obviously there's caffeine.
Caffeine can be useful. Outside of caffeine, not really. I don't think there's any true quote unquote fat burners on the market that are A, legal, and then B, the ones that are legal do anything.
Right.
So caffeine is interesting. It has 2 effects, and they're kind of go hand in hand. One is, and they do go hand in hand, it's stimulating the nervous system, right? It's a stimulant. You can take a high enough dosage to where that can potentially improve performance. We're talking like 4 to 6 milligrams per kg. So that's like, for a 200-pound male, we're talking 350 to 500 milligrams. It's a pretty hefty dosage, more than is in most pre-workouts, to actually improve performance. And then just to suppress tiredness, anything from 1 to 3 milligrams per kg. So we're talking like 100 to
a cup of coffee type of deal.
Yeah, a large Starbucks cup of coffee, right?
Right.
Or your standard pre-workout. Those are all pretty good dosages at suppressing tiredness. However, that stimulating effect at the higher dosages of actually improving performance, you can get a tolerance to it and it stops happening. However, it does continue to suppress tiredness, obviously to a point. If you're getting like 5 hours of sleep every night, there's a certain point where you can't caffeine yourself out of that.
We've all tried.
Exactly, right? Yeah.
It works for like a couple times and then doesn't work anymore.
Exactly. So you have to think, what is more valuable to me at this stage of prep? So maybe at the beginning of prep, when you're not feeling too run down, twice a week, you're taking a high caffeine dosage. And I would, not just straight away use 4 milligrams or 5 or 6 milligrams per kg. Right. I would use the lowest effective dosage where you feel pretty damn jacked up.
Yeah.
And then if it needs to go higher a little bit, or if you can, nudge it up. But, you don't want to take too much. And definitely not more than 6 milligrams per kg in a 24-hour period.
Yeah.
But once or twice per week on your hardest training days or heaviest training days to try to get a performance effect, awesome. And then once you start to get really beat down by prep, I would actually go down to a lower steady dose just to make it through the day easier.
Right.
And that may have some kind of downstream effect on your energy expenditure. Like, so if you're not dragging ass 24/7 just because you're taking 100 milligrams per day,
you're walking faster, and then you feel up to the stairs because you're not falling asleep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's one of those ones where the way you take it might change based on your energy levels, your stage of prep, off season, in season, etc.
Makes sense. Great. So I think then if you still have time, the last thing would just be laying out peak week. How does that look?
Sure. Yeah. So peak week, like you said, a big piece of it is just getting a pump and carving up to assist that pump. And I mentioned how blood pressure drops. Mm-hmm. Well, you might have heard the recommendation from health organizations to reduce sodium intake, especially if you have a family history of heart health. And while I don't 100% agree with that, and there are maybe some people genetically who that would make sense for.
Right.
For the vast majority of people, if you have a high sodium diet, your blood pressure comes up for a little while and then it goes back down. And we go, oh, so it's not a chronic effect. Well, we don't want a chronic effect as bodybuilders. It'd be great if our blood pressure could come up temporarily, and that actually assists with getting a pump and all that stuff. So I actually do, immediately prior to the pump up, I have my athletes take a high sodium quick acting meal, or literally just put table salt in
just
water,
drink some salt
down it. Yeah, which is not very tasty, but
well, you don't need that much because it's what is it, 2.3 grams of sodium per teaspoon of salt. So.
Exactly. So a lot of the times it's right around there, putting a teaspoon of table salt into a glass of water, slamming it back, and then getting their pump up. And that's after they've been carving up that day. Now, the peak week process is essentially just reversing flatness and reversing that blood pressure drop. I don't manipulate water. I don't manipulate sodium, and I don't even change the fat and protein intakes that have typically been in the diet. I might up the fat a little bit just because I don't want you in a deficit.
Yeah.
But typically it is having carb intake levels that are closer to your refeed days, and either a front or a back load approach. Neither method is better than the other. I might have said a different answer a year ago or 2 years ago. But essentially, probably the easiest for those listening way to do this is on Friday and maybe even Thursday. Thursday, just take yourself out of a deficit, and then through a carbohydrate increase. Friday, potentially go to a slightly higher than maintenance level, and then the day of the show be at maybe 80% between, like maybe the average of your low and your high days on diet. So you're trying to maintain that kind of carved up look. And if you really want to play it conservative and you don't want to spill over, which is relatively rare, just have a refeed the day before the show, and then have the average of your refeed and your low day on the day of the show. That'll prevent you from being flat. In most cases, that won't get you fully peaked. But if you're riding solo, it's very difficult to self-analyze this, and you don't want to be in a position where you've spilled over and you can't pull back. I used to recommend front loads to first timers, but they're actually kind of complex, having highs and then lows and then highs again. So I think that's probably the easiest way to go for someone just listening. But essentially what you're looking to do is just get someone's glycogen levels back up.
Yep. And for what it's worth, just for the listeners, that's what I've experienced myself when I've done it a few times, having to get really lean for photo shoots, is I just kept it simple like that. Just the day before, start eating a bunch of carbs. And the day of the shoot, eating a bunch of carbs, and getting pumped, and I don't know. I think I looked pretty good. It worked.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. Keeping it simple is very effective. I like to do multiple shows with people in a season, especially if they have to diet for 6 months. So typically they'll find their peaks get better, as I find out what are the limits of carbs I can push. Yeah. Sometimes I'll find the limit a little after the limit, and then the next one will come down and peak better. Yeah. So it's one of those.
That's really to that point where it's personal. This is where, and anyone that has kind of read or listened to people compete have come across that, where people say like it's kind of peak week. You have to kind of learn your body, which in other contexts when people say you have to learn your body, it can indicate like that they just don't know what they're talking about. But in
Right.
this
Yeah.
case, there's actually some truth.
And honestly, it's one of those things where we're not going to have effective research on it. I can't think of a way to do that. Maybe we will one day, but so we have to go on what makes sense logically based on scientific principles and then experience. So like basically it is a conservative carb up if it's your first time. If you've done it multiple times and you have quote unquote learned your body, then a more aggressive carb up, and then throwing back 1 to 3 grams of sodium based on body size immediately prior to doing a pump up, and then not doing a whole lot of the things you hear people do, like not doing extreme depletion, not cutting your water, not manipulating potassium, not drastically changing all your food sources. That's pretty much it. Obviously, when you carb up, you probably want those to be carbs that will actually turn into glycogen. You wouldn't want it to be all vegetables.
Yeah,
but
starchy stuff or
So just don't have a high fiber intake while you're carving up, and then that's pretty much it.
Awesome, that's great. This is really, really good. I think you've touched on everything, so that's super helpful.
Sweet. Wonderful.
So tell everybody, where can they find you and how can they check out everything else here? Because you have ebooks, which I've read, which are great.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah.
So if you want to talk about, your professional side.
For sure. Yeah. So I'm 1/5 of the Hydra that is, Hail Hydra. That is 3D muscle journey. Yeah. So check out 3dmusclejourney.com and you can, see the content that we have there, from all 5 of us coaches. And then we've got our YouTube channel at /Team3DMJ, where we have, since I want to say 2011, a library of informational videos. On Instagram, I'm Helms3DMJ. And I have, as much informational content as you can have on Instagram, but also some fun stuff.
I'm silly.
Yeah, I'm a pretty silly guy. Yeah, cats and stuff like that. And then
I feel like I'm too boring for social media. That's the problem. My life is too boring. I just do the same thing every day.
You just got to embrace it and make fun of it, and then you're good to go. Yeah. And then, my ebooks, as you mentioned, I wrote two books called The Muscle and Strength Pyramids, one for strength training and then one for nutrition. So they are for bodybuilders and powerlifters, everything you could possibly need to know about setting up your diet for nutrition and training. Those are at muscleandstrengthpyramids.com, and we also have some blog articles there, useful resources, email courses you can sign up for, and information about my co-authors, Andrea Valdez and Andy Morgan, who are both awesome in their own right. And I think that is pretty much it as far as finding me. Oh, and if you're a total nerd and you want to see my research, you can go to researchgate.net and search for Eric Helms, and you'll find my profile, and you can read all my PubMeds.
Cool. Awesome. Well, yeah, I highly recommend everybody listening to go check out Eric's stuff. Follow him. You're one of the few guys that I've consistently followed for, the last several years. And whenever you talk, I always listen. So for what that's worth, for the listeners, I just throw that out there, that if you want good information, good science-based information, also, obviously evidence-based is kind of a trend right now, and it's a good trend, I think, on the whole. But someone like me, I'm not a scientist. I don't pretend to be a scientist. Eric is a scientist. I like to read the stuff of people like Eric and explain it so everyone, so the layman can understand. But so you're one of the guys that I say, hey, here's a source of really good information. Like, I'm an interpreter and I have a lot of experience in my own realm, but so I appreciate people like you and the work you're doing, and I do my part to spread it around.
Well, it's an honor to hear that. I'm so glad, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, awesome. Well, just throwing it out there, if sometime in the future, if you have time, I would love to have you back on to talk about off season.
Yeah, sure, for sure.
Because everything that because everything you've discussed here, sure, it's great for specifically for contest prep, but there's a lot of great information here for people that maybe they're not wanting to prepare for a show, but just for knowing how to get really lean, essentially. Because Because, I get a lot of people reaching out for photo shoots, for example. You don't have to be necessarily as lean as for a photo shoot as you need to be for a bodybuilding show. But if you want, as a guy, if you want to look good, you want to be somewhere down around 7%, probably. If you want to, that's kind of the aesthetic type of look, right? 7-8%.
I think even like a legitimate 10%, you look pretty damn good. I think
what is a legitimate 10%? It's so hard. And when you look though, name any method of determining body fat percentage, and there are big error rates, including DEXA. Yep. So it's hard.
Dissection.
It's hard. Yeah, exactly.
I dissect my clients, so only get to work with them once.
So you're Dr. Frankenstein.
Yeah, pretty much.
Cool.
Yeah.
But anyways, that look where you're starting to see ab vascularity, you have pretty much just skin to pinch. So anybody just even looking to get that lean, it's not striated glutes, but it's pretty lean.
Yes,
can help. So on the off season side of things, then that would be for the average person more so they're done being really lean. Now they want to focus on gaining some muscle and strength and seeing how far they can push themselves until the next diet phase, basically.
Yep, that's 100% right. Yeah, honestly, because the diets are so intensive, a lot of winning shows happens in the off season.
Yeah,
so you can recover and then set yourself up for next time.
Makes sense.
So yeah, I'd love to come back.
Cool, awesome. All right, well, again, thanks a lot for your time. Totally appreciate it. And
you got it. My pleasure.
Absolutely. I know that this is going to be received well, so I appreciate it.
Awesome. Can't wait.
Cool.